What's interesting to me about both Tom Brady and Doug Flutie was that sort of underdog mentality, that having that chip on your shoulder type of attitude, in the sense of, I'm going to prove you wrong.
Welcome to Corporate Competitor, presented by Forbes Books, the podcast where executives share how the lessons they learned playing sports shaped their leadership. With me for today's episode is Lisa Borges, a leader whose career has been shaped by purpose, service, and a remarkable front row seat to high performance. Lisa has spent years working directly with two iconic NFL quarterbacks, Tom Brady and Doug Flutie, helping each transform their personal missions into nonprofit organizations. As the executive director of the TB12 Foundation, Lisa helps provide free access to training, rehabilitation, and nutrition resources to carry on Tom Brady's goal to redefine health and longevity. Before joining TB12, Lisa spent 18 years at the helm of the Doug Flutie Jr. Foundation for Autism. Her work there cemented her belief that leadership is about listening deeply and serving consistently. Make sure to check out corporatecompetitorpodcast.com/notes for my favorite quotes and reflection questions to help you apply today's insights. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me today. I'm honored to be here.
Well, you've had the opportunity. You've worked with legends, right? Two of the best quarterbacks, two really amazing people, Doug Flutie, Tom Brady, both of whom, ironically, made their names in Boston and then moved to Florida, right? As everybody does.
Yeah.
You should be moving to Florida, Lisa, just by the way. But what are the odds? So let's start, though. I want to talk about Tom Brady and his foundation and your work there for so many years. Can you share an interaction, a story that stands out to you from working with Tom in that foundation and the goals that it was set to, and the people that it was set to help?
Yeah, Tom is known, right, as a quarterback and leader for both teams he played, and he always really helped average players become top performers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in doing that, he was very curious about his teammates. And I always noticed that when he interacted with a lot of either our scholarship recipients or the high school students that participated in the programs that we had, he was genuinely curious about them as a person, what their goals were, and what they learned from the TB12 method and what type of daily healthy habits they had picked up. And again, it was just really amazing how he took the time to hear from each one of them and wanted to know, again, what their goals were, whether they played sports, if they wanted to go on and play in college. And the kids would have a chance to ask him questions as well. And again, they had some really great questions, and he always did a great job of sort of inspiring them to work hard and to be the best teammate that they could be. So, I remember him talking about, again, just the discipline. He learned a lot of that, being consistent and disciplined through his work with Alex Guerrero. And he would tell the players, you want to convince your teammates and the coaches that you're a hard worker, right? And show that to them. And the way he, again, talked about always lifting your teammates up and letting them know that they were a priority to him and that together they could accomplish a mission. And I remember him saying, if you don't lift those teammates up when you're accomplishing your own goals, and again, it should always be about the team goals and not your individual goals. No one's going to be there for you when you accomplish your individual goals if you haven't lifted up your team as well. So I thought that was always important. And that came from a student asking, how do you sell an idea to your teammates or to a group of people? So I thought that was an interesting question.
I want to go back though to the very first line you said when you answered that first question there. You talked about he helped average players become top performers. And you said he was very curious about his teammates. Do you think those two things were completely aligned? That the more curious he was, the better he could help people, the better he could help his teammates become their very best?
Yeah, I think when you're curious, you're making meaningful connections, right? And you learn about others' interests and what what makes them tick, what motivates them. So I think that's really important, whether you're playing on a professional team or building an organization.
Right. Or if you're in an office workplace, be
Right.
curious, learn something about your teammates, and that allows you to actually have a different relationship with them. And they then learn to trust you more, probably, I would assume.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly. There's that trust component for sure. And as they walk, his teammates are watching him work hard every day
Right.
and go the extra mile. And so of course they want to do the same.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about making the right decisions, and all of your decisions add up over time.
So if you could take you probably had a leadership masterclass just kind of being around Brady. I mean, he's quite masterful in that. Um, what aspect of his leadership do you think we can emulate? Like if you're talking to a group of business people, because that's who our listeners are,
Mhm.
what aspect do you think they can emulate to try to elevate their leadership?
The one that comes to mind first is the mental fitness piece or the growth mindset, right? Which is a part of the TB12 method. It was really one of the pillars, right? So discipline being a big part of that, and understanding that all situations or experiences are learning opportunities. So I think that would probably be, you know, the number one thing that stood out in learning from him. Again, it also was evident that he was a team player, uh, would collaborate, and it wasn't necessarily about his personal gain, right? But about the team success for sure.
Right.
And that also is shared accountability, right? They're keeping each other accountable for sure. Um,
Yeah.
the other piece is it's and this is not necessarily something that can be taught, but what's interesting to me about both Tom Brady and Doug Flutie was that sort of underdog mentality, that having that chip on your shoulder
Mm.
type of attitude, in the sense of, I'm going to prove you wrong. Typically in those typically that is a result of circumstances or maybe the environment that you've been in. It could be growing up with, money, or being, poverty. It could be rejection. Um,
It could be people saying you're undersized. It could be people
you're
saying
undersized,
you're
right?
the 199th pick in the draft. Right.
Right, right,
Yeah.
6th round pick, yeah. Or ongoing criticism, or always being told you're too small for play in the NFL. And but it was interesting because he would always talk about that to my son and wished my son had that, but he didn't, it doesn't come natural, especially for, my son.
You can't inherit a chip.
You can't. He has a completely different life experience and access to a lot of resources. But it's just interesting that both, Tom and Doug, I would say, kind of had that mentality.
Well, I will tell you, I mean, over the course of a lifetime of covering these kind of high performers, I would tell you that every one of them has a chip.
Yeah.
Whether it's Michael Jordan, who will point
Yeah.
out that he wasn't the number one pick in the draft, and that people didn't believe. that, he manufactured chips at times, which I'm going to bet, Tom did too, right?
Right.
I always loved it when you read Patriot stories where they were like, nobody believes in us. Are you kidding me? You won 4 Super Bowls, 5 Super, whatever. Nobody believes in you. Yeah, you're right. Nobody believes in you. But it's how you use it that works to your advantage. So I can't wait. We're going to talk about Doug Flutie in a minute, but I want to focus on TB12 first. Through TB12, you've seen the impact on people's lives. You've actually watched opportunities elevate. Could you share some stories, maybe a story that illustrates the difference that the work through that foundation made into the life of one of those who you served?
One in particular was a Green Beret, a former Green Beret who had been shot in Afghanistan in 2011. He had, I think, over 6 surgeries for throughout the years, 5 years maybe after that, and just continue, lots of rehab, but the pain was just always still there. And he talks about how, I think it was in 2016 at Christmas time, he was in so much pain he had to lay flat on the floor and watch his kids open up Christmas presents. And I think that was just sort of the boiling point of I need to find a different way to approach this, and how can I get rid of this pain? And someone had referred him to TB12, and he was able to get a scholarship there. And obviously it took quite a bit of work and some time, but eventually he was able to regain his mobility, his strength and endurance. And he had said to them, my goal is to run again. And they were able to do that. And I think he had also told a story when he was first shot that he told the doctor, they were saying, you may never walk again. And he said, I'm going to run a marathon. And of course, nobody believed him. Well, that's exactly what he did. After a few years working with the TB12 body coaches, he actually ran and completed the Boston Marathon in 2021 as a member of the TB12 Foundation's marathon team, and accomplished his lifelong goal. So that was amazing to see that.
As I mentioned, we're going to talk about Doug Flutie. I love his story. I love everything about him. And you worked for him for 18 years. So you obviously loved him too. But you were leading his foundation around autism. Tell me about the heart of that foundation and where Doug, why Doug, found that to be so important for him as a spot.
Dougie was, I call him Dougie as in Doug Jr. versus Doug Sr.
Right.
But, the interesting thing that he developed typically until age 3. He was talking. They have videos of him laughing, talking, playing with his sister. And then it regressed pretty quickly after that. And I think it was around the time they moved from Canada back to, his hometown, Natick, Massachusetts. And, one thing that was always very inspiring with Doug and Lori was the fact that they didn't sit around and feel sorry for themselves. Mm-hmm. There's an article that Jackie McMullen wrote over 20 years ago about Dougie, and it, from Doug's perspective. And it talks about, again, how Doug and Lori wanted to move on quickly. He basically said, where can we go from here? I've had to do a lot of that in my career. I know how to put last week behind me, which I thought was, a really profound quote. And shortly after, they created the foundation as a donor advised fund, grew it from there.
Research shows that 80% of us believe we have a book within us. But the number of people who follow through and do the work to create that book is far, far less. The reason is that the process can seem so overwhelming. And that is why I have partnered with Forbes Books to make the process easier for those of you who listen to this podcast and believe You have a story in you. So if you're ready to turn your leadership experience into your legacy, start your journey with us today at Forbes Books. Visit forbesbooks.com/Don to get started. Yeah, that's I love that line though. I know how to put last week behind me.
Yeah.
Right. Is there anything he did specially while doing that that really caught your attention? Like something that he did, some way that he was able to do that better than most. I mean, put last week behind him. Was there a way that he convinced himself?
I think it really does come from resilience, of course. I think it really does come from that, chip on your shoulder. I've always been told that I'm small, but I'm going to prove them wrong and keep going and not give up. Doug always talks about Dougie in the sense of that he keeps them grounded,
Mm.
right? And helps them put things into perspective in terms of what's important in life. And I think that's what he's always focused on, and Lori as well. So they, again, now it's been over 25 years that they've continued this foundation and have grown it and continue to show up, continue to engage, and continue to help other families. So they've really made a huge impact over all that time.
I will tell you, he was one of the first. That was one of the first places where I first grew to understand a little bit about autism, and was reading and learning the Flutie story. And years later, I would become the father of a child on the spectrum, but I was so grateful that somewhere along the line earlier I'd read a little, and maybe was intimidated a little less because of the way you all at that foundation kind of presented it to the world.
Yeah, it's again, they keep going. They keep going, and it's really amazing for sure. And Dougie is nonverbal and lives with them and has always lived with them. And so it's challenges and rewards, of course, but they live it on a daily basis as well. So
Yeah. So you've spent so much of your career, right, from your Bob Wolf days on to just around high performers, people who are playing at the peak, right? Intentional about their success, but also intentional about their longevity, right? I mean, Doug played for a long time too, and
yeah.
so what are some of the common denominators you've noticed amongst those who play well, play long? That maybe you've learned from and that we can learn from as well.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this before, but the mental fitness for sure, right? Um, and I think, this also being a servant leader, I think is important, and empowering others, right? Building that community and a sense of belonging for sure. And so they were admired and respected by all their teammates and coaches.
And they continued to do those things even outside of sports, right? I mean, sports was
Right.
just it was um, one vertical in their life. Is there a habit you watched in them specifically, something they really worked on, a way that they did what they did that you might offer us that we could think about as getting better?
It makes me think of a quote, my favorite quote, which is by Maya Angelou, which says, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made
You
them
made them
feel."
feel, yeah.
And I think that's treating people with respect and showing that you value them. And one way to do that is the genuine curiosity. And we talked about that earlier with Tom and whether it was his teammates or the high school kids who participated in the program. It's how are you showing people that you value them? And both have always done that in their lives, in their conversations, and whether it was, you know, w- walking through events, even back with Doug, I remember through fundraising events, sometimes, I had an agenda of what I needed to get done for that particular night. And I'm trying to get Doug maybe to the stage to speak to the audience, and at least 5 people want to stop him and tell their stories, about either their child with autism, or sometimes they just want to talk about football. And you know, Doug was always very patient and would stop and listen to their stories and tell them. And
And you're frustrated because you're trying to
yeah,
pull him, right?
I'm trying to like, all right, come on, let's go, let's go, gotta get to the stage. And but just being very gracious and showing that you as a person have value, and I'm going to respect that and be curious and ask questions. And that's what I've noticed both Doug and Tom do as well.
I love that. I love it. You know, in both cases, you're working at these foundations, but you're also having to build a team to help support the mission, right, of the
Mhm.
foundations. There are a lot of leaders today who are facing real challenges with turnover. It seems people are switching jobs more quickly than they change underwear. And, you know,
Mm.
when you're trying to build a team, obviously continuity is important. What have you found to be maybe most effective as you're trying to keep your team engaged to reduce that churn as you're trying to build those teams? What are some
Mm.
things you do to build that culture that people don't want to leave?
Yeah, it's interesting. Years ago, I remember taking an assessment, and I'm sure you've heard of it, the standout assessment, Marcus Buckingham. And
Mhm.
um, my top standout role was connector.
Mhm.
And it's just the idea of, the craving to bring people together to make something bigger.
Mm.
And, that's, I think, one of my skills is being able to bring people together. And it's a lot harder these days, of course, because a lot of us are remote and we don't necessarily see each other in person on a regular basis. But I think it's important to sort of build a community of, even if it's a team of 4 or team of 2 or 3, or larger. And, you know, being a nonprofit leader too, while you're sort of expected and you want to manage it similar to a for-profit, in the small and mid-sized nonprofits, you're also wearing many hats,
Mhm.
right? So you're taking on a lot of different roles, but being able to bring people in are sincere and authentic. And I was looking at, and thank you for sending over the book and the Habits of High Performers. The one that really stuck out to me that I've always done talks about creating a mission moment.
Mhm.
And so whether that's within every board meeting or every staff meeting, that's how I've always started it. What it could be showing a video of a grant recipient or scholarship recipient. In some cases, I was able to bring them in, when we were meeting in person, to share their stories. So focusing on that mission and reminding them, whether it's a weekly staff meeting or a quarterly board meeting, of why we're all there and what the purpose is.
That mission moment concept for me really came to life. I had the honor of serving on the national board of Make a Wish for many years, and Tom is one of the great wish granters in Make-A-Wish history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had the chance to be there for a wish he granted one time in Boston that I still tell the story today because it was so impactful. The amount of time he spent just loving on this little girl, right? Who
Yeah.
just and it was really amazing. And that little girl and her mother came and did a mission moment for us at Make-A-Wish, which was really cool.
Awesome.
And was allowed people to
Impactful.
realize. Right. It's impactful because you realize you want to make more of those things happen. So yeah, really important there. So I'd love to ask you one of the questions we've been really asking a lot of guests the last year or so is around the concept of momentum, right?
Mm.
The idea. Most of us who love sports, we can feel momentum shifts even from the top row of the stadium, right? But it's true in business or in charitable work as well, right? Sometimes you have a moment that propels you, or maybe it propels your opponent or somebody else, right? That you're and So my first question for you is, do you believe in momentum? Do you believe it's real?
100%.
Okay. And second, have you ever in the navigation of either one of these two amazing charities, have you ever had a moment or an event or a choice, a decision that you believe shifted the momentum of the way the organization's efforts, and maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think 2 come to mind, maybe 1 for each organization. With the Flutie Foundation, I mentioned earlier that when I came on board, it was a donor advised fund. And the momentum of Doug's popularity, and again, the Flutie Flakes were a really big hit at the time, just really made me think there's so much potential here. There's, so many more people that we can help. And it was quite a process to take it out of that sort of community foundation and create a separate 501(c)(3). There was a little resistance on one end, but the Fluties were on board, and I worked with their accountant to make that happen. And again, it took some time, but once we did, and we were able to bring in supporters and donors and board members who were passionate about that particular cause,
Yeah.
it really, really did take off in terms of programming, in terms of fundraising. Another example in relation to that is, as we watched Dougie grow and become older, and as a teenager and then as an adult, we, of course, were very aware of the lack of services for adults with autism. So we wanted to make sure that we uh, included adults. We revised our mission statement. And then a few years before I left, created a social enterprise called Flutie Spectrum Enterprises, which was, we created an office solutions business. So the idea was to give adults with autism meaningful employment
Hmm.
and
A
develop
real
their skills.
real place, a real difficult
Yeah.
spot. Yeah.
And they've really taken it really far, again, since I've left as well, and focusing a lot on helping adults with autism accomplish their goals, whether it's to be a broadcaster or a singer, or work in sports somewhere. But that focus has been really expanding to so many different individuals and families who, again, in Massachusetts at 22, services end.
Right.
It's
That's true of
and it's
most states.
on your birthday, right? That you
Yeah.
turn 22 and services stop. And it was very heartbreaking for families who didn't know what to do next. So that was the goal and the shift there.
Lisa, first off, the fact that you're on today with us is because you have listened to this podcast in the past and have communicated through LinkedIn, and that's how we developed our relationship that brought you to today. And so I love that. Thank you, and I love that's an encouragement, I think, to the many others who do listen and reach out through LinkedIn or other forms of social to communicate. But first off, I know now you're also in transition right now, and so how can people, if they're interested in some of the things that you're doing, how can they best connect with you?
Yeah, right now I'm doing some consulting through Anchor Foundation Consulting, and working with a few grassroots organizations here in the Massachusetts area as well. But LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach out to me.
Okay, we'll put your LinkedIn in the show notes. That'd be awesome. But Lisa, you have spent your lifetime working with high performers, and today I feel like I was blessed to be in the presence of a high performer as well. Thank you for being a corporate competitor with us.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate it.
How much fun was that? I love learning from people that through proximity are getting lessons just taught to them day to day, like Lisa. I mean, what great stuff! And think about having the opportunity. 18 years with Doug Flutie, so many years with Tom Brady. The opportunity to sit and just soak it up and be around great people. But my first great takeaway from Lisa really came from that work with Brady right? I love her line, how he helped average players become top performers, but his key was showing curiosity about them, not just not just average curiosity, right? But high intensity curiosity, learning what he can to so that he can build meaningful connections, which leads to trust, and then he could push them in a way that he couldn't otherwise, right? She used the word genuine to describe the curiosity, and I thought that was really important because a lot of people show curiosity, but it's fleeting. You don't know if they remember it. Curiosity at its genuine finest is something that now I can come back to you and I will remember things about you that will make our relationship stronger and better. Um, the second came from her relationship and her work with Doug Flutie and the Doug Flutie Jr. Foundation, right, for his son. When Doug Jr. was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, I love her line that Doug Sr. and his wife didn't sit around and feel sorry for themselves. They immediately asked, "Where do we go from here?" And I love that line from Doug. I know how to put last week behind me and not dwell on things that will put me in a bad place. How good? How good is that? Because what a great point of struggle for many of us, myself included. Um, if it's a bad week, sometimes it bleeds for me, and the great ones know you have to put the bad week behind you. You have to last week has to be in the past, and you got to be moving forward. And then when I asked her about the common denominators of some of these great ones and some of the things they did, she really focused on mental fitness, and a recognition through that mental fitness that all experiences are learning opportunities. You know, I've shared the story multiple times in a conversation with Michael Jordan. One time he said to me, "A loss is not a failure until you make an excuse," right? It was a loss, but it was not a failure because he didn't make excuses. He turned it into a learning opportunity. And that was what she defined as a common denominator among some of the greats that Lisa has worked with. I hope that you gained as much as I did today. I hope that you are excited about your 2026 and the amazing things that are going to come your way. I appreciate you.